Hi, everyone. So this is my summary of Unit 9. And actually, with this summary, I'm going to split it into two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to talk through the kind of setup of this labor market model. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk through how we can use that model to think about how different policies, but also different kind of shocks might have an impact on the labor market equilibrium. So what I'm going to do to begin with is introduce, I suppose, market model before then talking about the two really key aspects of it, which are the wage setting curve and the price setting curve. So the first really key thing is this very, very important assumption that we make, which is we're only considering a case where firms have only one input to their production, which is labor. So we kind of ignore any capital or other factors of production, and we assume that the only thing a firm needs in order to produce its output is labor. And then on top of that, and that means that the only cost they have is the wage they have to pay. And then on top of that, that's going to mean that profits only depend on three things. So the nominal wage, meaning what's the actual amount that workers are paid in, say, the particular currency in pounds or dollars, the price firm actually sells its good at, and then what's the average output produced by a worker in an hour. So we could also think of as what's the productivity of the worker. So first, really important assumption to summarize is that we assume the only input to production is labor. Then we have this particular way that we're going to picture how the firm makes its decisions, right? And what do we mean by its decisions? Well, there's two big things that the firm needs to choose. What wage should it offer its workers? And then what price should it charge for its output? Which is actually like, given they choose a price, and that's going to mean a certain level of output, how many workers do they need to produce that level of output? So we split up these stages into three different departments. So we imagine that the first department is human resources. And what their role is to do is to figure out what is the lowest wage that they can pay workers that will lead to the workers accepting jobs, but then also putting in effort. Okay, so they want to figure that out, how to kind of pay as little as possible to get effort, or to get acceptance of the job and to get effort. Then things move to the marketing department, and their job is to look at the cost of the firm, to look at the ISO profit curves, to look at the demand, and then to determine what would be the price that would lead to the result of choosing a price. That's then going to lead to a particular quantity. And then that's where the final department comes in, which is the production department. And what they do is they put department kind of say they're going to need. They are then going to hire a particular number of workers in order to produce that level of output. So these three elements of the firm are ones I'm going to refer to quite a bit, and we use them again in further units. So HR, picking the wage, marketing, picking the price, and therefore also the quantity of output, and then production, determining how many workers are needed to produce that output. All right, so after that, you get a little bit more, I use the word fudgy, in that we kind of imagine that firms are all making the same types of decisions, which will mean that all firms choose the same wage for workers, and that all firms will choose the same kind of price. So we see here, if all firms are charging the same price and they're all setting the same nominal wage, then we then consider, well, what is this going to mean for the whole labor market? And the thing we're interested in is, particularly from the worker perspective, what real wage is going to result, right? So the real wage is the nominal wage divided by the price level. And where is the price level coming from? Well, it depends on what prices all the firms are charging. But if they all charge the same price, then that is the price level. And where does the nominal wage come from? Well, that is what the firms are going to pay the workers in order to get them to accept jobs and put in effort. So if all firms do the same things, then the price level will just be the same as the price of each firm is charging, and the nominal wage will again be the same because all firms will make the same decisions. So then if we look at, well, what is the real wage in the whole economy, it's just going to be the wage, the nominal wage that a firm is paying, divided by the price that the firm is charging for its output. So why I say this is like a little bit fudgy is, again, we're making a big assumption here, which is that all firms behave in the same way. They all pay the same nominal wage, they all charge the same price for their output. Obviously a simplification, but it's going to help us understand how an equilibrium can be determined. So then there is a quick brief mention here, and these are two things we're going to go into a lot more detail on, of the wage setting curve. So this is a curve that shows us what's the real wage necessary at every level of employment / unemployment that will give workers an incentive to accept the job, but also then to work hard, to not shirk, as we'll see later on. So that's what the wage setting curve shows. What's the wage required so that workers accept and then put in effort in their jobs. And the second element in determining equilibrium is the price setting curve. And this gives us what is the real wage that firms are going to be offering based on their profit maximizing decisions. So based on this like combination of what the HR department do, setting a nominal wage, and what the marketing department do in terms of setting a price. The combination of those two things will then give us a real wage for the whole economy, and the price setting curve shows us that real wage. So before we dive into more detail on those things, just like a quick word about this diagram. So like we're going to refer to employed and unemployed quite a bit. So what do we mean by that? Well, what this is showing us is we've got a population, so that like all of the people in the country. Then we're thinking about, well, who's actually working? Well, only people of working age. So not people in education, not people who are retired. And within that population of working age people, we have the people who are willing and able to work, the labor force. But then there's also people who are maybe for some reason or another not willing or able to work, inactive, out of the labor force, or people who are inactive. And within the labor force, we then have the people who have a job, the employed, the people who don't, the unemployed. So just a kind of quick breakdown of some of the language we're going to use. Okay, so I think now what we're going to look at is the wage setting curve. And just want to move that. Sorry, 1 second. So I just wanted to make this a little bit smaller. So wage setting curve, as I said already, what is it showing us? Well, x-axis here, the proportion of the working age population. So as in like, up here at 1, that's like 100% of people. 0.5 actually where we start with here, say 50% of people. So as we move to the right, we're kind of having a higher proportion of the working age population. And then our y-axis here shows us the real wage. So what is this wage setting curve showing us? Well, as we move to the right here, that's more and more people being employed. And what the wage setting curve shows us is that as more and more people are employed, the wage that's required to get the employed people to put in effort, to say, take a job, and based on what we know so far, units, that should make sense, right? That when there's a higher level of worries about losing your job or a bit less, you're going to demand a higher wage to put in effort. And then the second important thing from this diagram is how can it show us what the unemployment rate is? Well, the vertical line here is representing what's the labor force, right? So this gap here between our blue vertical line of the labor force and 1, like 100% of the working age population, that represents the proportion of people who are not actively in the labor force. And so how do we determine what the employment or unemployment rate is? Well, just the gap between what proportion of people are working and what the labor force is. So if firms decided to pay this wage WL, we go across to our wage setting curve, And we know that that would correspond to this level down here of people being in work. And therefore, the gap between that proportion of the population and the size of the labor force, that gap there tells us our unemployment rate, right? And you can see labeled here is 12%. Now, if firms decided to pay a higher wage, then the wage setting curve shows us that we would have a higher proportion of people willing to accept jobs and put in effort, and therefore we'd get a lower unemployment rate. So you see 5%. So that seems all well and good so far. But in order to understand the shape of this wage setting curve, what we need to do now is actually talk about like, where does it come from, or how can we explain where it comes from? And I believe that's what we're going to go on to next. So let me zoom out even more on this so we can see both the top and the bottom here. All right. Actually, let me zoom back in just to look at the top in a little bit more detail. So this top diagram, one that we should be familiar with from a previous unit. I think it's unit 6, but I might have that wrong. And what we have in this top diagram is effort per hour. So the effort per hour workers are willing to put in versus their hourly wage. And we can think about an individual worker and this idea of a best response function or a best response curve. And so what this is designed to show us is at different wage levels, how much effort per hour would a worker put in? So if I just focus on this curve, first of all, this work put in more effort per hour. But as we get to higher wages, so if we're up here at really high wage and we say have a 1 unit increase in the wage, the increase in effort per hour is not as big as it would have been if we got the same increase at a lower wage. So that's why it kind of curves like this. And crucially, this curve has a particular position because we are assuming the unemployment rate in the economy. What would the wage be that firms pay this worker? So what they're trying to do is firms are trying to do it per hour. And this gray line here shows combinations of wages and effort per hour that would lead to the same level of cost of effort per hour. And we call these lines on the diagram ISO cost. I can't spell. Let me try that again. We call these gray lines ISO cost effort lines. So they show combinations of a wage and a level of effort per hour, which gives the firm a constant cost of effort per hour. So from a firm's perspective, they want this line to be as steep as possible, because the steeper it is, the higher the level of effort per hour they're getting. Effort per hour for them is getting lower and lower. So firms want this to be as steep as possible. So at a level of unemployment of 5%, what wage is the firm going to pay? Well, is going to get them the steepest possible ISO cost effort line, right? If they chose a way to be shallower, and so therefore higher cost, so less profit for them. So ISO cost effort line. So we know when unemployment is 5%, pay. But what if unemployment is a different level? So what if it's 12%? Well, here the worker has a different shifted to the left, showing us that they have a lower reservation wage, meaning that reservation wage is the wage where they would accept a job but put no effort in. So they have a lower reservation wage when unemployment's at a higher level. And that makes sense, because if there's higher or lower wage to take a job. But the second thing that's different is you can see at every wage level, compared to when we were at 5% unemployment, at every wage level, the effort per hour is higher. So when workers have a job, they're going to put in more effort per hour. And again, that's because of that fear of losing their job. So when unemployment is 12%, we see that a firm would choose this lower wage WL because that's going to give them, they're going to choose this wage WL, they'll get this level of effort per hour, where this point A is, and that's going to allow them to get onto this ISO cost effort line, which is the steep effort per hour, which is exactly what they want as low per hour. And so WL is the wage that they would choose if unemployment is at 12%. We'll have like two wages, the wages that firms would pay at different levels of unemployment. So now let's make the connection to the wage setting curve. So why is there a connection? Well, if we think about what the wage setting curve is designed to show us, it's supposed to show us what is the wage that workers would just accept a job at different levels of unemployment. Now, as we make our way from one further to the left, right, unemployment's getting higher and higher and higher because we've got a lower proportion of the working age population in work. And we've got our 2 points that we got from our best response functions above. So when unemployment was 5%, the wage that firms would have to pay to get workers to work was this wage WH, and that's our point B, which connects to this one up here. If unemployment was 12%, then we saw that firms could get away with paying a lower wage WL. And so that's why on our wage setting curve, when unemployment is 12%, we get WL as the wage that firms would pay. And we could imagine going back up to this diagram and doing the same thing for best response functions for unemployment levels of 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, all the percentages, and figuring out what the firm would do in terms of what wage they would pay. And if we did that, we could then construct this whole curve, right? We would then know at every level of unemployment, what wage would firms actually pay? What would be that minimum wage they could get away with that would get workers to put in effort? So that's how we construct this wage setting curve, through that sort of idea, thinking about this labor discipline model from Unit 6. Now, at this point, we make a little bit of a simplification, which is, before I was talking about workers choosing a level of effort per hour. So what we do at this point is actually imagine that workers don't have a choice of, say, zero up to 1 and everything in between, where 0 would mean where every hour they're actually not working at all, and 1 would mean where in every hour they're working for the full hour, and say 0.5 would mean in every hour they're only working 30 minutes. What we now do is just make a really big simplification, and we say that workers either put in 1, they just work all the time, or they put in 0, they don't work at all, or they shirk. And so how that relates to this diagram here is, we imagine that if the worker is, so if we're on the wage setting curve, that the worker is at a wage where it's just enough to get them to work, to put in work for the full hour. Whereas if they're below that wage setting curve, the wage is low enough that they just will shirk completely. So everything above the wage setting curve, right? All wages sort of above this wage setting curve will be wages where workers will put in full effort. So it would not make sense for a firm, say, when the level of employment or unemployment was here, right? And therefore the wage setting curve tells us to get workers to work, you need to pay, say, this wage W1. There'd be absolutely no reason for the firm to, say, pay a higher wage, right? Because it's not getting any extra effort. Workers are already putting in full effort, right? And a firm definitely wouldn't want to pay a wage down here, because then the workers would shirk. They wouldn't work at all. So with this simplification, we know that firms will always want to be on this wage setting curve, as in, if they know what the level of unemployment is, they're going to pay the wage that's matched up with that on the wage setting curve, because that will mean it's the minimum wage where workers will work, okay? And there's no reason for them to pay higher, because then they're not getting any extra effort for that. Or if they don't want to pay lower, because then the workers aren't working at all, which is obviously not what they want. So that's the first element of our model here, which is this wage setting curve. So what we do now is look at the price setting curve. And we're going to go back to thinking about, okay, this is the firm, because the firm chooses what the nominal wage actually is. The firm chooses what the price is. And then that's going to lead us to a particular real wage, which is what the price setting curve shows. So this table is really nice. It kind of takes us through what each department knows and what they have to do. So human resources, we imagine they know the prices that all other firms are setting. They know the wages that other firms are setting, and they know the level of employment based on other firms. So they know all of this stuff. Or a nice way to think about this is maybe they know all these figures for like last month, and now they're going into a new stage where they have to bargain with the workers again. So knowing all this, they then choose this nominal wage, right? And because they know the price level, or at least they know like the price level maybe last month, they know what nominal wage that nominal wage will correspond to then a real wage, which will make workers work, right? So they want to pick a wage that gets them onto that wage setting curve, which is the lowest possible wage they can pay to get effort. Then we go to the marketing department, and they know everything that human resources know, but one thing extra is they know what is the demand for their particular good. And knowing all of that previous stuff plus the demand curve, the demand function, they then decide to set a price, and we'll see how they decide that price in a second. And then after marketing's done that price is going to correspond to a level of output. And then the production people have to come in, and then they go, okay, we want this particular level of output. We know, say, what labor productivity is. We know what the production function is. And then we can choose how many workers we need to employ. So that's our model here. So, okay. We're going to talk about now like how the firm makes its decision. And one thing that's going to come back and be important in a few minutes is a couple of things here. So the slope of the isoprofit curve, which is equivalent to the firm's marginal rate of substitution, because it shows their willingness to substitute sort of price for quantity to achieve a constant level of profit. That is given by P, the price they charge. Now, when this derivation was done in Unit 7, I believe, it was price minus marginal cost over the quantity. Okay, I won't go through the derivation here. You can find that in the textbook in Unit 7. But why are we replacing marginal cost with W? Well, that I'll go through in a minute or two. And what we can show is that the marginal cost for this firm, remember that their only input is labor, and that the marginal cost is just going to be the nominal wage. So I'll go through that in a bit more detail in a minute or two, but this is going to come back and be important. And it's a really useful, some of the maths we're going to do in a second is really useful for thinking about how things will change if competition changes or if labor productivity changes. But for now, let's think about how does the firm make its choices. So first thing was, remember, it is the HR department. And so the HR department has to choose a nominal wage, and that nominal wage, so they know what the level of unemployment or employment is in the economy, and they then they then know what the wage setting curve looks like. So they go, okay, at this level of unemployment, we know we need to get a real wage equivalent to this particular value, and that will mean that workers will accept jobs and will put in effort. So that's what the HR department do. They're looking at that wage setting curve, and they're looking at the level of unemployment and going, okay, this is the real wage we need to achieve. We know the price level, so let's pay this nominal wage, and that's going to get our workers to work, to accept their jobs and to work. Then we go to our marketing department. So I might have said that before. It's a HR department first, setting that nominal wage. Now marketing department. And so the marketing department, they know the nominal wage here, W. Okay, so that's the wage workers are going to be paid. And we see this is like a horizontal line regardless of how many units of output firms decide to produce, they're paying every worker this nominal wage. So that's their cost. And then because they know like what their cost is, we can then, what the marketing department can then do is construct ISO profit curves. So lines or curves which show us combinations of price and quantity that would deliver the same level of profit for a firm. And then a third thing is they also know what the demand curve for the firm's output looks like. And as we've seen before, downward sloping. When price lowers, the level of output the level of demand will go up, so that they need to produce more output. So as we have seen in Unit 7, and we've seen in lots of places, or lots of units so far, how is the firm going to make its decision? Well, it wants to be on the highest possible ISO profit curve, right? The highest possible. So what is the thing that constrains the level of profits? Well, it's the level of demand. So the firm is going to choose a price somewhere along this demand curve where they achieve maximum profit. And so they're going to choose the place where the demand curve is a tangent to an ISO profit curve. And that's going to be right here at point B. And at point B, we know that the slope of the demand curve, which is the marginal rate of transformation, right? The ability to change prices into quantity or quantity into price. So that's the slope of our demand curve. And it's going to be equal to the marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of our ISO profit curve. So we know that has to be true at point B. And we know that if a firm chooses the point where the marginal rate of transformation is the same as the marginal rate of substitution, they will be choosing a point where they're on their highest possible ISO profit curve. So therefore achieving the maximum level of profit. So this is what the marketing department does. They choose the price P star that gets them to that point B on the demand curve, and that corresponds to a point Q star in terms of output. So there's the marketing department done. Price chosen, quantity of output determined. Then here's where we have another simplification in the model. We then assume that the quantity of output that's needed, we assume that the production function is like really simple. And so that if we need Q star output, then that's going to mean we need N star the same level of hours of labor. And that's because we're assuming, really important thing here, which is that the average productivity, or the average product of labor, or like the productivity of workers, which is given by this this term lambda, that is just equal to 1, meaning that every worker produces 1 unit of output per hour. So if we need Q units of output, we are going to have to hire a number of workers that can produce that same number, that's going to produce that same number, Q star units of output per hour. And so because lambda is equal to 1, that means that the number of workers is the same as the amount of output. Sorry if that wasn't that clear. Most important thing is we're assuming lambda is equal to 1, and that means that the quantity of output and the number of workers is the same. So from the production department's point of view, once they know from the marketing department that they need Q star units of output, they can immediately say, okay, therefore we need N star workers, and N star is the same as Q star. It's the same number. So that is the whole process of the firm. All right. We've seen they choose a nominal wage to give a real wage that will make workers accept the job and put in effort. Then the marketing department chooses a price level that maximizes the profits of the firm. That price level corresponds to a quantity. And then the production department know, given this quantity, we have to hire the same number of workers to then produce that output. So that then is going to take us to this diagram here, which shows the price setting curve. And just before I talk about that diagram, just going to take a quick pause before I go into that. Okay, so just picking up with this diagram. So there's a few things here to just like to talk through to make sure that we're really clear on. So the first is this red dashed line. So what this is showing, you can see, is average product of labor, and what this means, it's like it's the value of the output that workers are producing. Okay, and so that output's going to be sold by the firm and sold at a particular price, that like profit maximizing price. So that lambda shows us like what is the value of that output. Then the second important thing to look at is this price setting curve. So this was the second key element of this labor market model. And this is completely determined really, well, okay, not completely, because the nominal wage depends on what workers need to get them to work, but it's determined by the choices of the firm. So the firm chooses that nominal wage in order to achieve a real wage that makes workers work. And then they choose a price level, or they choose a price that will maximize their profits. And if we imagine that all firms are making those decisions in the same way, so they're all choosing, say, the same nominal wage for workers and the same price, so that the price level is the same as the price, then the real wage, which is just the nominal wage over the price level, is determined by the firm's decisions, and it's just a constant. And so that's what we're seeing here. It's this horizontal line, because from the firm's perspective, like whatever the level of employment is, they just have this constant like real wage that they're going to pay. And so that's where the price setting curve comes in. And what's the link between these two things? Well, the red line shows us the kind of total amount of money that can be made from selling a worker's output. And that has to split between two people, right? One is the actual worker, right? The worker who does the work, and their fraction is determined by the real wage level. So here we're imagining that like we're at an equilibrium at point B. So this level of employment, and like this is the real wage. And so the worker is getting that amount of the value of the output for them. And then the firm is getting the rest of the value of the output. And that's why you can see this bit's labeled the real profit per worker, right? So what is the real level of profit? The profit divided by the price level that's then going to the firm for every worker who's working. So that's what this diagram is showing us. So what's going to determine these two levels? What's going to determine how much of the value of the output goes to the worker versus how much goes to the firm? Well, if we ignore government, and in this unit, we kind of, to an extent, ignore government or ignore them for now, then there's two really, really key things that are going to determine the height of this setting curve, and therefore how much is profit, how much is wages. And those two key things are what's the level of competition in the economy and what's the level of labor productivity. And kind of what I want to walk through now is how we can show mathematically why these two things are important, and then to get to an equation which is going to link real wages to labor productivity and to the markup. And the markup is determined by the level of competition. And we're going to see that that's going to be a really useful equation for them thinking about how changes to competition and changes to labor productivity will have an impact on the real wage. So let's start by coming back to this idea of what is the kind of marginal cost of a firm, right, in this particular setup. And so remember, the only cost to a firm here is workers, is labor. So what is the unit labor cost? Well, we're saying that it's the nominal wage divided by labor productivity. So W over lambda. So why would that be the case? Well, this example kind of makes it, I think, nice and clear. If the nominal wage is $30 and labor productivity is 10, then that means producing 1 unit of output is going to cost $3, right? So the nominal wage, meaning what is the wage, say, per hour, is $30. So $30 per hour. And lambda tells us how many units of output a worker produces in that hour. So therefore, you have to pay a worker $30 per hour. They produce 10 units of output per hour. So every unit of output is costing you $3. And so therefore the unit labor cost, as in the cost of labor per unit of output. So your marginal cost, right? Because that's what marginal cost is. It's the cost you have to pay to get an extra unit of output. It's $3. So that's why we can think of the marginal cost of the firm as sort of the nominal wage over lambda. And remember that we assume kind of throughout this chapter, really, although we're going to weaken this in a second, we assume that lambda is equal to 1, which means the unit labor cost is just the nominal wage. Okay, so that's like our first important ingredient, kind of keeping that in mind, that marginal cost is just this unit labor cost. So next important thing is something else that comes from unit 7, which is how is the firm's markup determined? So in unit 7, there's a derivation which has gone through, which shows us that the markup of a firm is looking at what proportion of the price is profit. And so that's what this left-hand side is, right? If you find the difference between price, how much you're selling the output for, and marginal cost, how much it costs you to produce it, and then divide that by price, what you're getting is like what proportion of the price is profit, because price minus marginal cost is like the profit per unit of output. And we see on the right-hand side here, we showed in unit 7 that the profit margin is equal to 1 over the elasticity. So there's a link between elasticity of demand and the profit margin. And we can see the link is if elasticity reduces, so if demand becomes less elastic, then that means the profit margin can go up. And this should make sense, right? When there is less elasticity of demand, and that's going to happen when there is less competition, right? If there's less competition, then the demand curve becomes steeper. It's allowing firms to choose, it's allowing firms to set to achieve higher profits. If there's less competition, firms can get higher profits. So that's why there's this link between these two things. Lower elasticity is going to link to, comes from less competition. And so less competition means lower elasticity, means firms can achieve a higher profit margin. So this is kind of indicating the like first part of what I was saying before, why level of competition is important for determining the like split and determining where the price setting curve is. Now what we're going to do is try and get like a really explicit relationship between the real wage and then the markup and then also the labor productivity. So, okay, what we're doing here is just saying, well, markup, which represents, this is like mu, what we use to represent this, is equal to 1 over elasticity. We saw that above. And so P minus C, the price, minus the marginal cost over the price, right? This is just us rewriting what's above and using the symbol mu to represent that 1 over elasticity, or to represent the profit margin. Okay, oh, sorry, not the profit margin, represent the markup. Really careful with that. Markup, slightly different from profit margin. Profit margin is, yeah, so this is the markup, sorry. So mu is the markup, price minus marginal cost over price. Okay, so where are we going to go next with this? So the goal here of this bit of maths is to try and get a link between the real wages and labor productivity and the markup. So this bit here is just what's coming from above, that mu, the markup, is equal to the price that a firm charges minus, now here we've replaced the C. The C represents the marginal cost. We've replaced it with what I discussed above, that the marginal cost is the nominal wage divided by the productivity of labor, right? Because we discussed above that is equivalent to the marginal cost. So we've got markup is equal to price minus marginal cost over price. Then the line below, all we've done is divided each of the terms in the numerator by P. So P over P gives us 1. And then W over lambda over P, we're just now rewriting that as W over P over lambda, and that's fine. And now you can start to see where we're getting closer to a relationship, because W over P, nominal wage over price level, that's real wage. And so what do we do next? A little bit of rearranging and then multiplying each side by lambda, we get ourselves to this position where W over P, real wage, over lambda equals 1 minus mu, and then one more step. And so we've got two ways we can express this. So W over P, this is the thing I was promising. There's real wage. So real wage is equal to lambda, which is productivity of labor, times 1 minus mu, 1 minus the markup. Or we could multiply that out and get this, but maybe this one here, this is, I think, the easier one to think about. And what is it showing us? Well, if lambda increases, if productivity of labor increases, real wage is going to go up. And again, like that kind of makes sense. If you like rationally, that makes sense. Or if you just kind of think about it, it should make sense. If workers become more productive, if they're able to produce more output, you would expect that to be rewarded with higher wages, higher real wages. So that one makes sense. Now, what does this right-hand side show us? Well, it shows us if mu, if the markup is getting bigger, right? And why might that happen? Well, possibly because there is less competition. So if that markup gets bigger, meaning firms are able to achieve higher prices, we're going to see that that's going to bring real wage down. So what we now have is a link between competition and real wages. So if competition goes up and the markup goes up, then 1 minus mu gets smaller, and so the real wage is getting smaller. So there's our explicit link between level of competition and real wages and productivity of labor and real wages. And that's why this formula is a really, really good one to keep in mind. Particularly the examples we're going to talk about later on, really, really helpful to use this formula to think through those. So that's pretty much it for this first part, aside from, to come back to, like, how do we determine an equilibrium in the labor market? Well, it's going to be the place, the real wage and the level of employment where our price setting curve, right, which remember is determined by what's the nominal wage needed, what nominal wage will translate into a real wage, which will get workers to work. Oh, actually, no, sorry, I've said that a little bit wrong. So let's go back. Price setting curve. So that comes from what nominal wage have firms set, and also what prices have firms set. And the combination of a nominal wage and a price level will determine what the real wage is. And that's what the price setting curve shows us. It shows us the real wage that allows firms to profit maximize. And then the second ingredient is the wage setting curve, which is showing us for different levels of employment or unemployment, what wage is required to get workers to work. And so where those two things meet, where the real wage, the price setting curve, the profit maximizing real wage, which is given by the price setting curve, where that meets our wage setting curve, that's going to determine what the level of employment or unemployment will be in the economy. Right? So that's how we get our equilibrium with this model. It's where that price setting, where the price setting curve and the wage setting curve meet. And so we've got our real wage and then a level of employment as well as a level of unemployment. So that's how we kind of set up this labor market model, combination of the labor discipline model to give us our wage setting curve, and then the kind of unit 7 ideas of what's going on in the firm to give us our price setting curve, where they meet, give us our equilibrium. So I'm going to stop the first part of the video here. And then in the second part, we're going to use this model to think about how equilibrium would be affected by different policies or different types of shocks. But yes, let me finish part 1 here.